Welcome to today's version of the 2021-2022 World Language Webinar Series. Today we're looking at the TEL Learning Experience domain and specifically LE5 and its sub-criteria. This is part one of the broadcast. The broadcasts we're doing this year are paired, so there are two on each TEL domain that we look at. So this one for LE5 part one is today, and LE5 part two is on March 9th. We appreciate having everyone here, and I'm going to get us started by taking a look at our agenda on the next slide. We'll begin today with a welcome and introductions to each other as well as to our guest speakers. Then we'll have an overview of the TEL criteria and sub-criteria that we're focusing on. You see it there on the screen. LE5 says the teacher provides opportunities for students to investigate cultural products, practices, and perspectives in order to interact appropriately with others. Then we'll go on and reflect a little bit on implementing LE5 with our proficiency-based North Carolina World Language Essential Standards and talk about the evidence you would see of LE5 characteristics and behaviors in K-12 world language classrooms. And we'll finish up with some wrap-up and reminders at the end. Our goal is to have a 1-hour broadcast. As I said, we'll begin with welcome and introductions. My name is Anne-Marie Gunter. I'm the World Languages Consultant at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. And I want to make sure you're familiar with your Webex event control panel. We use Webex events as the way to do our webinar series. You see on the screen a screenshot of what your control panel likely looks like that you're looking at. This may differ a little bit depending on whether or not you're using a computer or a smart device, as well as which web browser you chose to join us today. As you can see in the upper right corner, there's a way for you to adjust your video layout. Typically in these broadcasts, I just show our slides in order to cut down on the pressure on our wireless systems with video. Our guest speakers may, though, choose to use their webcams. We'll see. So you can choose different ways to look at your video layout and the panel view. In the middle of the screen, you can see that there are meeting controls. Those are hidden or they disappear when we're not using them, but then they reappear if you just run your cursor over that area. The ones that are most important are the ones on the left-hand side. A little microphone that has the slash through it. That's because everyone comes in on mute because we're recording. That helps cut down on our background noise during the broadcast. Also, in the middle of those buttons, you see there's one that says, has a little word bubble that takes you to the chat feature, and you can send a message to me or to anyone through the chat box. We'll also be using that for some of our activities. And then finally, on the right-hand side, the button that's orange with a little X on it is what you'll hit when we're done today and you're exiting the webinar. If something comes up and you have to exit earlier or you accidentally hit it, but then you need to come back in, don't worry. You can use the same link to come back in as you initially got into our broadcast today. So those are our meeting controls, and you should be able to see those on your screen. I also want to introduce our guest speakers. They're going to talk about LE5 today. These are world language teachers who've distinguished themselves by earning Teacher of the Year honors through FLANC, the Foreign Language Association of North Carolina, or through NCVirtual, or they've earned the Global Educator Digital Badge. I'm going to put in the chat box some information about those honors so that you can learn a little bit more about those achievements and maybe even how you could become a FLANC Teacher of the Year or earn the Global Educator Digital Badge. Today, we have 3 guest speakers. The first one is coming up on this slide. He's on the line, so I'll let him introduce himself.
Hey, thanks, Anne-Marie. Hello, everybody. My name is Jeff Pageau. I'm one of the FLANC Teacher of the Year. I was the 2013 FLANC Teacher of the Year. I am currently the IB Diploma Program Coordinator for Nash County Public Schools, and I also still teach. In addition to my coordinator duties, I currently teach our upper level French courses, French 3, French 4, and the French B SL, for those of you who are familiar with IB. And I also work part-time with NCVirtual, and I teach whatever they need. Right now, I teach French 1 and French 2 for them.
Great, thanks so much. Next up is Bonnie Wang. Bonnie, you're on the line. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi everyone. I hope y'all enjoy the weather right now. And this week is going to be much warmer than before. I think the spring is coming to us. My name is Bonnie Wang. I teach Chinese, and I am also the curriculum consultant for our school in terms of the diversity, equity, and engagement this year. I currently teaching Chinese 1, 2, 3, 4, although we are calling them, we're actually actualizing everything. I'm teaching novice Chinese, novice high, intermediate low, intermediate mid, and a Chinese for heritage and advanced topics class right now. I'm super excited to be here with y'all, and thank you for your invitation and your facilitation, Anne Mary.
Sure, happy to have you on board, just like with Jeff. And I'm looking, our next guest speaker is coming up on the screen, but I know she has a class that ends late, so she'll probably be joining us a little later. But Lisa Worthington-Groce was the Flank Teacher of the Year in 2018 for K-12. She's at Northwest Guilford High School, where she teaches German. You can see multiple levels of German in Guilford County Schools. And she also works for NCVirtual and teaches, I think, French 2 this year. I'm pretty sure that's correct. Notice her pictures show her as making sure that she has both a German and a French teacher background to share with you. Also, I just noticed now that Melissa Perez is on the line with us today, and she has added information in about Flank accepting nominations right now for the 2021-2022 Teacher of the Year. So she's put that link in there. If you're interested in nominating someone or being nominated by someone, please go ahead and check out that information. I believe, Melissa, those nominations are open through, is it April 1st? Yes, April 1st. So those nominations will be open for a while. Look for that information too to come out from Flank, obviously, but also on our World Language newsletters that come out usually every Wednesday. It's our hashtag World Language Wednesdays newsletter. That information will be shared in there too, so that you can get that and use that as you need to. All right, well, now that you know our guest speakers a little bit, let's go ahead and find out who you are and what you want for today. My first question here is, what motivated you to participate in this webinar today? You can check all that apply to your situation. Was it to access professional development made for world languages? Was it to earn one contact hour for license renewal? Was it to gather information to share with others? Was it to learn about implementing our state standards from other teachers? Or did you want to find out more about state standards, resources, policies, and so forth? I'm going to go ahead and run that question. And you should be able to answer right on your control panel. You should be able to click on the answers that correspond to your reasons for wanting to participate in the webinar today. All right. Looks like almost everyone has answered. Please go ahead and get your responses in so we can close out our poll and see what we decided on why we're motivated to be here today. All right, thank you for sharing your responses. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and then share the results with you, so you should be able to see them in your control panel now. It looks like the majority of people are here to earn one contact hour for license renewal, and that's important, especially as we get closer and closer to the time when most licenses are needing to be renewed. Typically, our licenses are up for renewal at the end of a school year in June. You will get one contact hour for participation in our live broadcast, and that will come to you about a week after our broadcast today. Also, a good number of you are here to access professional development made for world languages. That is the very reason we do this World Language webinar series, is to make sure that you have specific professional development that helps you as a world language teacher implement our state standards. There's also over half of you here to either gather information for others, colleagues maybe in your team or PLC or in your department, your school or your district, and also to learn about implementing our state standards from other teachers. Teachers do learn best from other teachers, as we know, and that's why it's so important to have our guest speakers here with us today to share from their classrooms. There's also about a third of you or so who are here to find out more about our state standards, the resources available with them, and the policies and so forth that guide our work in K-12 world language education. Great. Thank you so much for that. Also, we want to know where are you joining us from today. So North Carolina is broken into 8 different regions as you see on the map. Of course, you could be in one of those, or you might be in another state, possibly outside of North Carolina, as well as maybe outside of the US. So please go ahead and let us know where you're joining us from today. All right, this poll's a little faster. Just one answer, of course, for everyone. Please go ahead and get your responses in. All right, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share our poll results with everyone so you can see too. Looks like we've got quite a spread from west to east as it appears on our slide, as you can see in the poll results. We've even got someone here from outside of North Carolina for today. So welcome to everyone. I'm glad you're here to join us. All right, so let's get into the TEL criteria that we've chosen for today and its sub-criteria. You see it there on the screen again. The teacher provides opportunities for students to investigate cultural products, practices, and perspectives in order to interact appropriately with others. Of course, you probably know these as well as our 3 Ps, products, practices, and perspectives, that go with our culture standard. Here is an overview of our state standards and how they're organized. With LE5 and the focus on cultural products, practices, and perspectives, of course, that links directly to our 4th standard of culture. Notice the weave graphic on the side there. We have our 4 standards on the left-hand side of interpersonal communication, interpretive communication, presentational communication, and then number 4, culture, like we're focusing on today. Woven throughout that, we have our 3 strands, which also helps us align to our national standards. That connections to language and literacy, connections to other disciplines, and communities. This document, or this graphic for the weave graphic, is available in our administrator guides for world languages. We actually have 3 of those for our 3 different types of K-12 programs. And so I'm going to put into the chat box links to each of those documents so that you can get them if you don't already have them. Those administrator guides always have this overview of our state standards on page 1. Each of them has that, so you can take a look at that and share it with others who may need to know more about how our world language standards are organized. All right. Now, like any teacher, of course, I want to make sure everyone has the handouts and information they need for today's work. So our next activity here is also to download the handout for today. And that's specifically our TEL Learning Experience domain so that we can take a close look at LE5 today as we're working. And you can have that as reference for yourself. What I'm going to do is put a link into the chat box of where you can download this either from our Google Drive as a PDF or from the TEL framework page. TEL, as many of you know, is the Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning Project, TEL for short on the acronym, and it's a national project. It's been going on for a number of years now, almost 10 years. The first publication of these TEL domain documents that we worked with came out in 2014. Over time, they've gotten feedback and improved them, and the most current documents were released in 2019. And so that's the 2019 version that we're working with today. So I'm going to pause for a moment, let you download a copy for yourself from either the Google Drive or the TEL framework page, and then skim the 4-lettered sub-criteria for this session's focus, LE5. Pause for a moment while you do that. All right. I hope you've been able to download a copy of the document for yourself, get it up on your screen, or maybe even print it out if you prefer hard copy. So let's go ahead and take a look at LE5 in detail and think about that or reflect on how that could help us in implementing our North Carolina World Language Essential Standards. Doesn't matter what level of students you teach or which language, this applies to us all. So think about how this makes you think about our culture standard. Let's go over our TEL subcriteria. A says that the teacher facilitates activities that allow students to recognize and understand how their own culture affects their views of other cultures. That's a critical component of world language learning because we should learn as much about the cultures through the languages we're studying as we learn about our own. B is the teacher facilitates activities that allow students to recognize and understand the perspectives they and others have. C says the teacher facilitates activities that allow students to interact with cultural products, practices, and perspectives to contextualize language tasks. And finally, D. The teacher facilitates activities that allow students to use their language skills and cultural awareness to interact effectively in a cultural context other than their own. So notice that all of our subcriteria start with the teacher facilitates activities that allow students to, and then do something with the language, particularly with using the language in an appropriate way. We also want to think about our 3 Ps, products, practices, and perspectives. With products being the basic products we think of, food or something like that, that we are teaching students about. Those products that you can point to. So books, maps, those kinds of things that you might use to help students become more familiar with the language that they're learning through different cultures. Then we look at practices. This is the way people do things in regards to that product. And then finally, perspectives has to do with the beliefs and values that people place on culturally what's happening with the products and practices. One example that we like to use in North Carolina is basketball. Of course, basketball is a popular sport here in North Carolina as well as around the world. And so when we're teaching students about things like sports as a topic, often basketball comes up. Of course, basketball is a product, the game of basketball, the rules and so forth that you can point to and how it's played, those are all part of the products from a cultural standpoint. The practices have to do with how we do basketball. So there are, for example, school teams, and now there are traveling teams. You play basketball competitively at the high school level, at the college level, and even at the professional level. And there are other things to go into how we do basketball. And finally, the perspectives. What are the values and beliefs associated with basketball or with, sports in general? So there might be things like sportsmanship or loyalty to your team. Or a good work ethic so that you continue to improve and help your team. And teamwork itself is a perspective and a value that a lot of people associate with sports and particularly basketball. So those 3 Ps, the products, the practices, and perspectives, are important to think about. Many times in the past, world language educators have been accused of focusing too much on products like foods or flags or festivals, that you always hear those things, and not talking enough with their students about the practices and how that works and the perspectives of why that's important to the culture that you're learning about and important to your own. Because remember, we're learning about our own culture as we reflect on what we learn in a language classroom. Obviously, our current standards focus very much on incorporating all 3 Ps, and I know we've been doing that. But it's important to reflect back on that and to think about how far we've come with world language education and what we might have experienced as students ourselves versus what we want our students to understand when we talk about culture. So let's take a look and think about those, reflect on those sub-criteria for your own teaching. When you think about your teaching and how your students learn, which of sub-criteria are professional strengths for you? There's 4 of them, so you can choose 1 or 2 that you feel are professional strengths. Think about how you as a teacher facilitate activities, as it says, that allow students to use the language in regards to culture and the 3 Ps. I'll go ahead and launch our poll. This one's just a little bit longer because it involves some thinking and some reflecting on your part to really consider your strengths, which might change over time. We've been through a lot these last couple of 3 years, and how we teach and what our students need and how they learn best has shifted a little bit for us. But that's okay. We can still think about what are the professional strengths for us when it comes to culture. I'll go ahead and open that poll and you can reply. All right, got about 20 seconds left to get your responses in and think about which of these are professional strengths for you this school year. All right, thank you for responding. I'm going to go ahead and show you our results. We have the most even poll I think I've ever seen in our broadcast this year, and that is because across our audience today, and there's almost 30 people on the line, it looks like there was someone who felt that each of these was a strength for them. We have almost half of everyone saying that they have a strength in one of those four, two of those four across the board. So that's really good. That means that the implementation of culture is going quite well. And as you reflect on that, you can come up with a lot of examples of how that looks in your classroom. Well, I'm going to keep our poll showing because we might want to refer to it here later and move on to the next part of our broadcast. And that is our guest speakers. First up is Jeff Pageau. I asked each of our guest speakers, when you think about your teaching and how your students learn, which of the sub-criteria are professional strengths for you? And then they chose some of those, just like you did in the poll a moment ago, to talk about with you today and think about how they facilitate activities in their classroom with their students that help their students practice those 3 Ps and implement them effectively. So Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, well, thank you again. And I just noticed when I was looking at the who's here today, I see a couple of familiar names from the French community. So nice to have you here today, French teachers. And also a special hello to our world language consultant from our central office. So glad to have you here too, Ms. Wiggins. Glad you could make it. So yeah, I was thinking, you know, what was Anne-Marie was talking and made some notes to myself to kind of share today. One of the things that really stands out to me when I look at these standards is they don't necessarily have to be taught in isolation. There's a lot of crossover that can take place here between 2 or 3 or all 4 of these substandards. That's what kind of stood out to me. The other thing I would say to teachers who are wondering, like, what's the best way to go about this is I always, when I'm developing lesson plans or unit plans, I always think first about the cultural element, and then I go from there. Like, what is the cultural focus I want to teach about? And then connect all of my vocabulary, grammar structures, grammar points, whatever, around my cultural theme. So some things that I've been working on that have been pretty successful and with the kids, and they really reacted to it pretty well, that supports these standards is this. I'm sorry, my notes are all over the place, so my apologies. And I think this might be a particular challenge for certain languages over others. In North Carolina, French teachers, I'm sure you can agree with what I'm about to say, for a lot of our students, French is indeed a foreign language. We're probably, if you are like me and you teach in a rural community, you are probably the only other French-speaking person your students probably have any interaction with. So we have that added challenge of, you know, bringing that cultural relevance to what we're trying to do in the classroom. And it is also very hard for certain languages to find that cultural connection. One thing that I've been working with, and this is to Anne-Marie's credit, is the MOU that she started 2 years ago with the Académie de Reims. We've been doing a virtual collaboration with a high school there. That has been really amazing for my students. I did it with just one class. Well, they were sophomores when we started it, so we're in our second year now. And that has been really a neat way for the students to interact with like other French people, to talk about some of the issues and things that we talk about in class. And it allows them to, you know, exchange with peers in France and in the target language. So they're speaking in French. They've created their own little, we tried to manage it, the teacher and I, by creating a WhatsApp group where we could monitor the conversation, but the kids have all found each other on various social media platforms, and which is good. And they've been able to carry these conversations outside of us as well. We also will meet together once a month, usually, sometimes twice, and we will structure the sessions based on whatever cultural point we want to talk about with the students. So we use that opportunity to have these conversations in French about social issues, social topics that are being explored in each of our classrooms, which in turn gives them that opportunity to understand other people's perspectives. So that's been kind of a cool project. The other thing that I was going to share is kind of like what Anne-Marie was just saying, kind of thinking beyond some of those cliche go-to cultural topics that people might gravitate towards because they're easy to go to. I would challenge everybody who's listening to this to think outside the box and don't be afraid to tackle those delicate topics. Like, for example, two things that I was going to share today with you is one of the things that we look at is understanding the connection between language and identity. And I try to, the topic that I build this around is looking at French community in Louisiana. So we take a look at Francophone, what does it mean to be Francophone today in 21st century in Louisiana? We look at the historical context of French presence in the state and the oftentimes challenging past that the state has had with the French population there. And And then I try to bring it back because many of my students are heritage speakers of other languages, typically Spanish and Chinese is what it tends to be in my classes. And we look at this idea of being a heritage speaker and comparing it to their own experiences as being heritage speakers of their home language, whatever that might be. And it's been really cool to kind of see how the students who are heritage speakers can really, like, this whole lesson really resonates with them because they get it and they're able to understand that perspective. That's been a pretty neat thing. Anne-Marie, how am I on time? I didn't even notice what time it was when I started talking.
You're good. Got a couple more
Okay.
minutes to wrap up, and then we'll move on.
The other thing that I was going to share, and this is something I'm doing currently right now, taking that, another go-to topic that some people like to go to is like doing that art unit, which is fine and has its place. But I've been doing a unit that I hope to present at Flank this fall, looking at street art and having discussions around, what defines art, and is street art, is it vandalism or is it art? Who decides what is art? And looking at street art to explore social issues that are happening in France and other French-speaking countries. And that's been a really well-received unit so far. We're about halfway through with it. But then we've been also looking at, looking at students' own perspective about street art and graffiti and their own perceptions about graffiti that they see maybe in our community in Rocky Mount. And then we look at some examples of other street art throughout France that I've curated while I've been there. And we just make the cultural comparisons between, what are the issues that are being portrayed through street art in France, for example, versus things that we've seen in Rocky Mount or other places that students have been, maybe in Raleigh or whatever. And then we come to the realization, the students come to the realization that, a lot of the same issues that are being portrayed in street art that they see here in the US is similar to challenges that are happening in other parts of the world. And it just helps students to understand that, some issues are universal. And I think it helps students to, who might live in, more isolated communities, who really don't have a big grasp of the world outside of their county. Doing projects like this, I think, really helps to get them to understand other people's perspectives more clearly. So I will pass it over to, I forget who's next on the agenda.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. It's very helpful to think about what you see in your own classroom, especially with our heritage students who are taking their third language, and also to consider things like those street art concepts and things. Jeff also mentioned the MOU that the state of North Carolina has with the Academy Durham in France. That has been in place for a couple of years now. It's actually signed during the pandemic, if you can believe that.
Yeah.
But there is certainly a school partnership application that you can apply and get a partner in France from here in North Carolina. And you do not have to be just a French teacher to do that. Teachers of any language or any subject can do that. So something to think about, particularly when we consider culture and teaching that with our students. All right, so we are moving on to the next slide. We're going to hear from Bonnie about her professional strengths and how she facilitates activities in her classroom that allow her students to use culture in intercultural language competency ways. Bonnie?
Yes, and thank you, Jeff, for sharing your perspective, especially highlighting our heritage speakers who are taking either a third or a fourth language in their life. And growing up, those heritage speakers, they're always living their lives through multilingual and multicultural communities and cultures. And for those students, it's very important for us, for the educators, to point out when we are allowing those students to accept another culture. How much do they know about themselves? How much can they express, can they introduce about their own culture to others? And I think when Anne-Mary asked me to pick several criteria over here, I picked A and D. And I think both of them, they are very well aligned with the intercultural can-do statements by Necessful Actful. And then I will put that in the chat about the link. I'm sure all of you know this intercultural can-do statements when it first came out back in 2017. You can click and download and take a look. So one criteria of the intercultural can-do statements is interact, and the other one is called investigate. So for me, I'm going to talk about one is to investigate, which in the TEL criteria, it shows in the teacher facilitates activities that allow students to recognize and understand how their own culture affects their views of other cultures. And just like what I said, for all of us, we understand that our students, they live in this multifaceted community, and many of them, there's no this solely singular form of culture in their life. Many of them, they are navigating between or among different cultures in their life. When they come to school, they pick a specific identity among many other identities of themselves. They pick the specific language, usually English, to talk to their peers and their teachers and others. When they come back home, they may pick a different identity that they feel more comfortable with. They pick a different language, they feel more comfortable, or in that case, in many cases, they have no choice to speak in the language with their parents' generation because that's the language for them to communicate. And also, like many of our students, they are struggling. Some of them they enjoy, some of them they own both or all the cultures that they are involved in, but some of them they are struggling. They want to give up some of their identities. They are not feeling proud, or they are not feeling represented most of the time in their life. And in that case, they want to hide some of their true identities, or they want to make a choice, to pick a side as well. And if we, the educators, we understand that reality of many of our students, then we know what to do when we are with them. Then we are asking them to recognize how their own culture affects how they are looking at other cultures, because what is being told, what is being taught at school, what is being what's being told by adults, what's being taught at school, what's being highlighted in the social media, and what is being marginalized in all contexts in their own culture really affect the way they learn the world. Some of them are not like some of those things are going on in the world are not highlighted or are not specifically discussed in the context, and that way they will never know, they will never learn about the truth of the history or the truth of another community. And the way that we are evaluating, we are viewing, we are taking our perspectives in when we are learning about a different culture, we're all biased, and the biases are from our own culture, what has been brought to us, what has not been brought to us. So in our teaching in a world language class, it's just really easy to guide our students through this process, because they can code switch. When we are learning about the Spanish culture, the Hispanic speaking culture, the Spanish speaking culture, I'm sorry, and Chinese speaking culture and French speaking cultures, our students, many of them, they are speaking English as their native language. They can code switch, they can think about, imagine themselves being in this social role in the targeted culture. And then on the other hand, they're thinking about, oh, what about this group of people when they come to America, or this group of people when they come to the English speaking countries or regions? This is how they will feel. So teaching them the cultural comparisons is also teaching them how to code switch in different using their different roles and using their powers to navigate in different constituents. And then the next one is like after we help them investigate the cultures, and now we're teaching them to interact properly, right? The teacher facilitates activities that allow students to use their language skills and cultural awareness to interact effectively in a cultural context other than their own. So I think this criteria really emphasized the intertwined connection relationship between the language and culture. They are not separable. You can't only teach the language without addressing the culture. That's not, it doesn't work. And of course, if you are teaching a culture, there are always if you're not teaching a culture in a target language, you're not teaching the whole culture of the targeted community, right? So I think my suggestion for all of us in this call is to think about the culture in this plural form in a more bigger picture. If we're talking about Francophone culture, we are also looking at, as Jeff pointed out, what is going on in the Francophone culture in New Orleans, in the United States, in Canada, not only in France. And when we are talking about the Chinese speaking culture, the Chinese communities, we're not only talking about the Han Chinese people living in the mainland China. We're also thinking about, oh, what is going on in Singapore? What about and I'm talking about Mandarin speaking culture. So what about in Taiwan? What about in the Chinatown? What about in Chinese communities overseas, outside of mainland China and Taiwan? What about in Malaysia? So a lot of them are making our targeted culture a very diverse unity. You cannot only pick this one slice. Okay, let's talk about Chinese culture. Let's only looking at this region. Is not realistic, and we all know that. And when we are, of course, when we are teaching the Hispanic culture, when we're teaching the Francophone culture as well, we are asking students to actively compare, actively include as more diverse as they can and as more inclusive as they can. So our world language classroom it shouldn't be a classroom that only talk about this one slice of the target cultural community. It should be more broader than that. And the more we can ask our students to connect themselves with the culture, the better the class will be. Because if we're giving them an example with this culture or this country or region that is so far away from them, and they cannot imagine one day they are being in that region, speaking that target culture, speaking that target language, then why they're learning it? We're not encouraging any motivation. If we are encouraging any motivation, if we are inviting our students to get involved, to know themselves better, and to see the future possibility of them using the language, engaging, interacting in the culture properly, I think that's the solution for our enrollment. That's the solution for the lifelong learning that is one of the 5 C's goals.
Wow, thank you, Bonnie. It's a lot to think about, and I hope everyone has also been looking in the chat box. There are people commenting, starting with Jeff's presentation about how street art is very interesting for our learners and impressive, very motivating to them to learn about that. People asking about the MOUs. I put some information in there about our MOUs and how you might apply to get a partner. Also, there's people talking about what Bonnie's been sharing with us and thinking about things like Generation 1.5, those that are kind of lost between two cultures or torn between two cultures, and how it's important to represent all cultures where a language we teach is spoken. Because, we say we teach one language, French or Chinese or German or Spanish, but you think about the many, many cultures that exist around the world where that language is used, whether it's the primary language for a particular country or geographic area, or it's a secondary language. There's a lot of things that go into that. Also, we've got people commenting on how we make things relevant, and to think about Bonnie's point about, another strategy is take a topic and explore it through the lens of let's say the mainland country you think of for your language, like France, if you teach French, but also from another French-speaking country, or like Bonnie said, Chinese-speaking countries around the world who might look at it slightly differently. All right, we are good on time, and we're now going to turn to our third guest speaker. That is Lisa, and she has been resolving some tech problems behind the scenes, so we're in good shape. I'm just going to unmute her so she can share with you about her professional strengths from TEL Criteria LE5.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to confirm that you are able to hear me.
Yes, you're loud and clear.
Perfect. I'm really excited to be with you all this afternoon to speak about the topic of culture in the world language classroom. It's something that I'm very, very passionate about. And I think it's something, as Jeff reiterated earlier, that we can use as a framework to build students' communicative skills. And I think culture is really about those relationships and the way that we interact with ourselves, with the people around us, and with the world. So students from the very beginning, from the novice level, should be getting cultural exposure within your classroom through things like images, graphs, headlines, political posters, videos, interviews, commercials. I feel that we're so fortunate to live in the 21st century when we have access to all of those things from target cultures around the world at a touch of a button through the internet. And I just think, over the past 20 years of my teaching career, how that globalization and instant access through things like the internet have really changed how we teach languages and how we approach culture in the classroom. So again, I think even for the novice learners, this idea of products and practices are really important. And I think for a lot of teachers, it's, easier to get those products and practices into the beginning level language classes. But sometimes maybe we're a little bit nervous to figure out, well, how do I tap into those higher critical thinking skills that we know our students have and want to develop when they've got these novice level language skills. But I think that's something really important for us to do, again, starting with those beginning learners. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples of how that might look in my German or my French class. So I think many of us, when we're working with beginning language learners, we talk about school and things that are very accessible to the students, things that are part of their everyday lives. And a lot of my students, when they begin learning a language, are 14, 15, 16 years old, since I teach high school level, and are going through the process of driver's education. My own daughter is in the midst of that right now. So we will kind of talk about what the students experience in terms of driver's education, and then view commercials, view posters, find out about the cost of driver's ed in other countries like Germany. And the students are always shocked and surprised to learn that the driver's education process is so different from what they're used to. I think here they have maybe 30 hours of in classroom learning, and then they get out on the road for a few more hours, and they pay maybe $20, $30 to take the test, and then essentially they're licensed. Whereas in other countries, it costs several $1,000s to get your driver's license. If you do not pass the first time around, you have to go back and take more driver's education at a private drive-it school, pay more money, and again, still no guarantee that you're going to succeed on the driving test. Once you have that license, then you've got the cost of gasoline to consider. So, comparing when people complain here at $3 a gallon, and you go to certain countries, like in Europe, and you're paying $10 to $15 per gallon, you can have students do those unit conversions. And I think students are shocked to see how something that many of them kind of take for granted can be challenging in other parts of the country. And so we'll examine why that might be. which often brings us to a discussion of things like the environment and the availability of public transport, and eventually to a discussion of, you know, that personal autonomy that many Americans depend on, especially in places where you don't have that ready access to public transportation. But also the idea that you don't want a two-person family to necessarily have 4 or 5 SUVs that they're driving, polluting the environment. So I think it's really important to already start having those sorts of discussions, even with those novice level learners, and really scaffolding and helping them talk about those issues. We know that products answer the question what, practices the how, and perspectives the why. And I think the why questions are the ones that the students really will get into and will carry with them. As Bonnie mentioned, we want these students to become lifelong learners. We want them to take what they learn about in our class out into their daily lives. And I think those why questions are really going to stick with the students and will help them kind of see the interdisciplinary nature of what they're learning in the world language classroom. Lots of studies have shown that young people today, in particular Generation Z, are very mindful of politics, and especially of climate change and the environment. And so that's a topic that I really like to articulate and scaffold through the levels. So for the beginners, like I said, we would look a little bit at population density in different countries and how that might affect policies. We would look at trash sorting and recycling. They can do interviews with each other, with family members, and compare that to, you know, people from the target culture and rates of recycling. As they move up into novice high, we would look at shopping practices, plastic usage, air pollution rates. And then as they move into intermediate and advanced, we would begin to have a discussion of the role of the government versus individual liberty, and kind of those creative solutions to environmental practices. I'm a big fan of debate in the classroom. So for those of us who teach mixed level classes, I think especially with the pandemic, you know, even if you are just teaching a level 2 class, we all have that sense that everyone is at their own rate of proficiency. So one thing I like to do is have the more advanced students tackle articles where native speakers debate the pros and cons, either spoken or written, and the students read a text. Or view street interviews where they talk to people on the street about how they feel about a particular issue. And then my advanced students will kind of simplify the arguments they heard for the beginners, for the novice level students to use, so that they've got these phrases in front of them and they can decide whether that's a pro or con, and then debate. And that, I think, is a really important skill that the students can use to talk about culture, to compare their own culture to the cultures they're learning about, and hopefully affect change in the world moving forward as we move past Generation Z to Generation Alpha and beyond. So I hope this has given you all a few things to think about. I'm excited. I see the little number 9 in the chat room. I'm excited to see some of the feedback there, and to keep this conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for sharing your perspective from the classroom and giving us lots of ideas about what to do when it comes to culture and doing those cultural comparisons that students get very interested in. Well, we have had some additional chat going on in our chat box. I hope you've been kind of catching up with that when you can. People commenting about how they'd like to provide functionality to language learning and to promote engagement, how they do like modeling and reinforcing appropriate behavior regarding other cultures. And because students really struggle with that and maybe struggle with the idea of how do you show respect in another culture? How does that work, you know? We've also had some very deep questions asked about things like, how do you help bicultural students not feel self-conscious about their roots, but then in fact, how do you help them feel proud of who they are so they can appreciate and enjoy learning their native language or their home language? And so lots of good questions too. Given our time, I'm going to go ahead and roll us into our last activity here, where we kind of think about characteristics and behaviors of LE5, and we may be able to answer some of the questions you're seeing in the chat box. So when we think about our LE5 subcriteria and we think about culture and teaching that in the classroom, we look at our subcriteria and we think about the verbs. What is the teacher can do to facilitate activities to get the students to use the language so that they're working with products, practices, and perspectives, and contextualizing that and doing things appropriately as they reflect on their own culture as well as the cultures that they're learning about. So here's what I'm going to have you do. I know people are bubbling over in the chat with ideas and things that they do already, but we're going to have a waterfall in the chat activity, and that's where you put an answer together for a question, but we hold off putting it into the chat until we say go. So in the chat box, I want you to type the letter of one of the subcriteria, A, B, C, or D, that you think is important in implementing our World Language Essential Standards, or WLES. You can choose one of them that was a professional strength for you, or one that you've heard one of our guest speakers talk about. You could choose one you think is pertinent to answering a question that's been asked in the chat box, maybe Jose's question, or that you've thought a little bit deeper about when it comes to facilitating activities that help our students grapple with what they're learning in regards to culture. So your choice, but just pick one of the sub-criteria that you want to talk about. Then, in 15 words or less, explain why you think this sub-criteria is critical for our state standards. Why did you pick that one? Why is it the most important? How is that shown in your classroom and the work you do with students? And then, like I said, when I say go, you click enter so that we see a waterfall of responses. Some people call this activity flood the chat. We have to be kind of careful, culturally speaking, with the word flood in North Carolina. So I like waterfall better. It's not as overwhelming as flooding can be. So go ahead and type your response, pick one of our subcriteria, and in 15 words or less, explain why you think that subcriteria is critical for our state standards. And maybe use an example from your classroom or respond to some of the questions or comments in the chat. All time is out, and then when you hear me say the magic word, we'll watch the waterfall of responses. All right, I hope you've got your response ready, starting with the letter of the subcriteria. Go. Let's see the waterfall of responses and what you decided. All right, we've got several people choosing A and B. The A folks are saying that it helps students to connect with culture. Several people are mentioning D, and some of the examples from our guest speakers, the driver's license is different in countries and cultures, so that's very interesting to students. They can use that reality compared to countries in the target language. Got a lot of people talking about B. Students need to learn about our connection with the world with different cultural realities. And students need to connect, and it helps them as they discover themselves and learn more about culture. Also got people picking D. That's important for students to appreciate and understand other cultures. It's critical because understanding builds respect of other cultures and people. And also D, it's value to emphasize equity and inclusion in our work. B, in teaching a world language, Carrie finds it essential to teach inclusiveness on every level and connect to the world beyond the walls of the school. So how are they reaching out beyond their classroom and using what they've learned in their lives? Also, when students can see the world through other people's eyes, it'll help them develop positive human connections with the people around them. Yeah, very good. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this, and many, many thanks to our guest speakers. We appreciated hearing from you today, the examples from your classroom, as well as your thoughts as an experienced teacher with a lot of expertise to share with others. So thank you for sharing with us, sharing those examples and your insight into teaching culture. All right. We're going to wrap up. I know we are at time. If you can stay for a few more minutes, I just have a few things to share. And then we will be out for the day. If you have to go, that's okay too, because we are recording, so you can always catch up later. First things first, I want to let you know that by attending today, I'll make sure you're on the World Language Instructors listserv, but you can sign up for any of our listservs at NCDPI, whether it's a World Language one or another one, by going to that link for the NCDPI listserv sign up and signing up for any of them that interest you. Also, coming up next, I wanted to remind you that this is part of our World Language Webinar series. These are the 2 paired webinars for LE5. Our next broadcast will be on Wednesday, March 9th, where we'll have some additional guest speakers to talk about this particular TEL criteria and how they apply that in their classrooms. As you know, materials and recording from each webinar are posted as archives, and so you see the link there where you can register for part 2 of LE5, but also go into the World Language Webinar Series Canvas Hub for details, access the archives, and access information about future webinars. The archives are available for a period of time and can be completed asynchronously to earn a certificate of completion. And there you see the webinar series. That certificate of completion for the asynchronous option for anyone who wants to share information about this broadcast are due some weeks after the broadcast for a particular TEL criteria have ended. So right now, the broadcasts that were done in January and February, their asynchronous option is due on March 16th. And for our current one, the LE5 parts 1 and 2, that asynchronous credit option will be due April 13th. Finally, don't forget, you will get a certificate of participation today that comes to you as an email and an attachment, and it will be about 1 week from today. You can use that for license renewal, but please note in the upper right of the screen, our public school units, districts, and charter schools must approve our professional development offerings in all formats to go for license renewal. So please keep that in mind. That's it for today. We thank everyone for joining us. And again, we thank our guest speakers for all that they've shared with us today and given us to think about when it comes to implementing our state standards in our classrooms with different languages and the different cultures we're teaching as we teach those languages. I'll go ahead and put my contact information also in the chat box if you would like it. You can see it on the screen, of course. I would encourage everyone to take a look at our new NCDPI World Languages website. It's there at the bit.ly link, bit.ly/NC World Languages. Also want to thank my supervisor, Dr. Stacy Daniels. She's on the line with us today, as you saw from some of the comments. We appreciate her joining us and know that she has quite a multilingual background herself, although she's over not just world languages, but also ESL and English language arts. And finally, Teresa Parker is our administrative specialist. That's the person who'll send you the email with your certificate of participation for today. Again, thank you for joining us. We hope you have a great evening and that we'll see you soon at some of the things that are coming up for world language educators, as well as the next broadcasts in this series.